Welcome to Cafe Tales. This is Ailey, your host for today's mystery. Before we begin this story, I just want to thank you all for the love and support. Trust me, writing these stories feels like sharing a piece of my imagination with friends who truly understand it. And your comments, your kindness, they mean more than you know. If you enjoy this story, please give Ida a like and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Before we start, tell me where you're tuning in from. Let me know in the comments. Now pour yourself a cup of coffee. Stay curious and let's get started. The Tango Murder. Chapter 1. The Golden Tango. I confess that when I first suggested Tommy old friend Hercule Poirot that he might enjoy a visit to Buenos Aires, I had not anticipated the particular circumstances that would make his stay so memorable. At the time, absorbed as I was in the management of my cattle ranch in the Argentine pampas, it seemed natural enough to invite him to experience the vibrant culture of this remarkable city. How little did I know that within 48 hours of his arrival, we would be confronted with a mystery as complex and deadly as any we had encountered in our long association. It was the evening of March 15th, 1938, when Poirot and I made our way through the elegant portals of the Salon Dorado, Buenos Aires' most celebrated Tango Hall. The establishment occupied a magnificent Belle Epoque building in the fashionable Recoleta district, its facade adorned with carved cherubs and gilded cornices that gleamed beneath the electric street lamps. Inside, the atmosphere was one of refined opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished marble floors, while the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the aroma of fine wine and Argentine cigars. "Mon ami," observed Poirot as we paused in the ornate foyer, "this is indeed a temple to the passions, is it not?" His keen green eyes surveyed the scene with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize over the years. Even in evening dress, impeccably tailored, naturally he maintained his characteristic precision. His mustaches had been waxed to perfection, and he carried himself with the dignity of a man attending a royal reception rather than a mere social gathering. "I say, Poirot," I replied, adjusting my white tie. "You must admit the setting is rather magnificent. Buenos Aires society certainly knows how to entertain." The gala that evening was in aid of European refugees, a cause that had attracted the cream of the expatriate community. As we entered the main salon, I was struck by the cosmopolitan nature of the gathering. Here was a microcosm of Europe transplanted to the Rio de la Plata. Elegant ladies in Worth gowns conversed in French, German, and English, while distinguished gentlemen discussed business and politics in the measured tones of the international set. Our hostess for the evening materialized before us with the grace of a seasoned diplomat. Mrs. Victoria Petton was a handsome woman of perhaps 55, possessed of that particular brand of British dignity that travels well. Her silver hair was arranged in the latest fashion, and her dark blue velvet gown was cut with a sophistication that spoke of Parisian couture. Diamond earrings caught the light as she extended a gloved hand to Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in cultured tones, "what an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Buenos Aires. Captain Hastings has told me so much about your remarkable abilities." Poirot executed one of his precise little bows. "Madame Petton, the pleasure is entirely mine. Your reputation for charitable works has traveled even to London." A slight flush colored her cheeks at the compliment. "You are too kind. I do what I can for our fellow Europeans who have found themselves displaced by recent events." Indeed, the shadow of European politics seemed to hover over the gathering, despite the festive atmosphere. Conversations would drift from the latest fashions to hushed discussions of developments in Austria and Czechoslovakia. The guests, I noticed, formed natural clusters based on nationality and political sympathy, though all maintained the veneer of social civility. It was then that the evening's entertainment began. The lights dimmed, and onto the small stage stepped a vision that caused a perceptible stir throughout the salon. Señorita Carmen Delgado was perhaps 28, with raven black hair arranged in an elaborate chignon and skin like café au lait. Her crimson gown clung to her figure with an audacity that would have been scandalous in London, but seemed perfectly natural in this exotic setting. As she began to sing a haunting melody in Spanish that spoke of lost love and betrayal, her dark eyes swept the room with an intensity that seemed to touch each listener personally. "Magnifique," murmured Poirot beside me. "She has the gift, that one, to make each person believe she sings for him alone." I followed his gaze and observed something curious. While the majority of the audience was captivated by the performance, Mrs. Petton's attention seemed divided. Hearies moved frequently to a tall, fair-haired man standing near the French windows that opened onto the patio garden. He was perhaps 40, with the bearing of European nobility, and the eton of someone accustomed to outdoor pursuits. There was something in Mrs. Petton's expression, a mixture of anxiety and longing, that struck me as oddly intense for a woman of her evident sophistication. The song ended to thunderous applause, but I noticed that the handsome stranger had slipped away toward the garden during the final verses. Carmen's eyes had followed his departure with an expression I could not quite read. "An interesting evening already presents itself," observed Poirot quietly, as the applause died away and conversation resumed. "The human heart, mon ami, it reveals itself in the smallest gestures, does it not?" As if to underscore his observation, Mrs. Petton excused herself from a group of admirers and moved purposefully toward the same French windows, through which the mysterious gentleman had disappeared. The patio garden beyond was illuminated by strings of electric bulbs, and I could see couples strolling among the flowering jacaranda trees and ornate dove-cotis that housed Mrs. Petton's prized collection of white doves. The evening was warm, filled with the perfume of jasmine and the distant sound of tango music drifting from a neighboring cafe. It seemed impossible that within a few hours this scene of elegant pleasure would be transformed into the setting for a crime that would challenge even Poirot's remarkable powers of deduction. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Night. The evening progressed with that peculiar intensity that seems to characterize gatherings, where diverse personalities are thrown together by circumstance, rather than natural affinity. As Poirot and I circulated among the guests, I became increasingly aware of the undercurrents that flowed beneath the polished surface of Buenos Aires society. "Captain Hastings!" called a voice behind us, and I turned to find myself face to face with Dr. Heinrich Müller, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60, whom I had met briefly upon our arrival. His English was precise but heavily accented, and there was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested depths carefully concealed. "Dr. Müller," I replied cordially. "I trust you are enjoying the evening." Indeed, though one cannot help but be reminded of similar gatherings in Vienna before. He paused, his expression darkening momentarily. "But we must not dwell on the past, must we? The present offers its own complexities." Poirot had been listening with that air of polite attention he adopted when gathering information. "You have been long in Argentina, Herr Doctor?" 3 years now. Like many of us here, I found it prudent to seek new horizons. Dr. Müller's smile was thin. "Mrs. Petton has been most generous to those of us who arrived with little more than our professional qualifications." "She is indeed a lady of considerable charitable instincts," I observed. "But charity, it sometimes comes with its own price, does it not?" murmured Poirot thoughtfully. Dr. Müller's eyebrows rose slightly. "An interesting observation. Monsieur Poirot, Mrs. Petton is certainly thorough in her interest in those she assists." Before Poirot could pursue this intriguing line of conversation further, we were interrupted by the arrival of a striking couple. The man was the same fair-haired individual I had noticed earlier, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of classical features that suggested noble ancestry. His companion was a petite brunette with nervous, darting eyes and hands that fluttered constantly at her jewelry. "Allow me to present Klaus von Habsburg," said Dr. Muller, with a formality that bordered on stiffness, "and Frau Elisabeth Richter. This is the famous detective Monsieur Hercule Poirot, Captain Hastings." Von Habsburg inclined his head with aristocratic grace. "The reputation of Monsieur Poirot has reached even to our small community here. We are honored by your presence." His English was excellent, though tinged with a slight Austrian accent. There was something magnetic about his personality, a confidence that drew attention without effort. I could well understand why he might have captured the interest of both Mrs. Petton and the beautiful Carmen Delgado. "You are too kind," replied Poirot. "And you, Herr von Habsburg, you also find Argentina congenial after Europe?" A shadow crossed the man's handsome features. "One adapts, monsieur." Frau Richter's nervous laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Klaus is too modest. He has made quite a success here, haven't you, darling? The ladies of Buenos Aires society find his European manners quite irresistible." There was something sharp in her tone, a bitter edge that made me glance at her more closely. Her fingers worried at Ottoman bracelet, and I noticed that her wrists bore faint marks that might have been bruises, though the dim lighting made it difficult to be certain. At that moment, Carmen Delgado approached our group, having changed from her performance gown into a more subdued dress of midnight blue silk. Up close, she was even more striking than she had appeared on stage. Her features were perfectly sculpted, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that belied any assumption that her talents were purely decorative. "Klaus," she said softly, her voice carrying just the faintest tremor. "I hoped we might speak privately." Von Habsburg's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Carmen. Perhaps later, when the evening is less occupied." "Later may be too late," she replied, her gaze holding his, with an intensity that made the rest of our little group seem to fade into insignificance. The tension between them was palpable, and I noticed that Frau Richter had gone quite pale. Before anyone could respond, however, Mrs. Petton materialized beside us with the timing of someone who had been observing from a distance. "Carmen, my dear," she said with a brightness that seemed forced, "what a magnificent performance. You quite transported us all. You are very kind." "Victoria," Carmen's smile was polite but distant, "I was just telling Monsieur Poirot about your remarkable journey from the provincial theaters to Buenos Aires society," Mrs. Petton continued, her tone carrying subtle undertones that made me uncomfortable. Such an inspiring story of transformation. Carmen's dark eyes flashed, and for a moment I thought she might make some cutting reply. Instead, she merely inclined her head gracefully. "We all reinvent ourselves when necessary, do we not, Victoria? Some of us are simply more honest about it." The conversation had taken on the quality of a fencing match, with thrusts and parries couched in the language of social pleasantries. Poirot, I noticed, was observing each participant with the focused attention of a naturalist studying exotic specimens. As if sensing the need for a change of subject, Dr. Miller cleared his throat. "The political situation in Europe grows more troubling each day. One wonders what the future holds." "Indeed," agreed von Habsburg, though his eyes remained fixed on Carmen. "Revolution has a way of redistributing fortune and misfortune alike." "Some revolutions are more personal than political," observed Carmen quietly, and I saw Mrs. Petton's grip tighten on her evening bag. The group began to disperse as the evening drew toward its close, but not before I caught several meaningful glances exchanged between our various companions. Mrs. Petton's expression as she watched von Habsburg escort Carmen toward the garden was particularly revealing, a mixture of pain, anger, and something else that might have been desperation. "Most instructive," murmured Poirot, as we found ourselves momentarily alone near the French windows. Through the glass we could see figures moving among the shadows of the patio garden, where the white doves cooed softly in their ornate coats. The evening air carried the sound of muted conversation and the distant strains of a melancholy tango from somewhere beyond the garden walls. It was a scene of romantic beauty, yet I could not shake the feeling that beneath the surface of this exotic paradise, dangerous currents were beginning to steer. Chapter 3. Death. Among the doves, I was awakened the following morning by an insistent knocking at the door of our hotel suite. The clock on the mantelpiece showed barely 7 days, and the golden light streaming through the windows suggested another glorious Buenos Aires day. Beside me, Poirot was already sitting up in bed, his hair, which he never allowed anyone to see in its natural state, covered by a silk nightcap. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "I fear our peaceful morning is about to be disturbed." The knocking continued, accompanied now by urgent voices in Spanish. I threw on my dressing gown and hurried to the door, where I found a uniformed police officer and a young man in civilian clothes, whose agitated expression spoke of serious trouble. "Senor Hastings?" the young man asked in accented English. "I am Miguel Santos, secretary to Senora Petton, and there has been—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Please, you must come at once. Senora Petton is dead." The words struck me like a physical blow. Dead? But how? When? "She was found this morning in the patio garden of the Salon Dorado. The police. They say it is murder." Within the hour, Poirot and Ihad dressed and accompanied Santos and the police officer to the scene of the tragedy. The Salon Dorado, which had seemed so elegant and welcoming the previous evening, now wore an atmosphere of grim solemnity. Police barriers cordoned off the entrance, and uniformed officers moved purposefully about their duties. Inspector Carlos Ramirez, a stocky man with intelligent dark eyes and a carefully waxed mustache that seemed to pay homage to my friend's own magnificent facial hair, greeted us in the main salon. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in excellent English, "your reputation precedes you even to Buenos Aires. I confess, I had hoped never to require your particular expertise, but circumstances have conspired otherwise." "Alas," replied Poirot gravely. "Murder, it has a way of appearing when least expected. You will permit me to examine the scene?" "Of course, though I must warn you, it is most disturbing." Inspector Ramirez led us through the French windows into the patio garden. In the bright morning sunlight, the scene was transformed from the romantic bower, I remembered, into something far more sinister. The jacaranda trees cast dappled shadows across the flagstone paths, and the ornate dovecotes stood silent, their usual soft cooing replaced by an ominous quiet. Mrs. Victoria Petton lay near the central fountain, her evening gown of dark blue velvet spread around her like the petals of some exotic flower. But it was not the position of the body that struck me most forcibly. It was the extraordinary sight of hundreds of white dove feathers scattered in a perfect circle around her form. "Mon Dieu," breathed Poirot, and I saw his green eyes narrow as he began his characteristic, methodical examination of the scene. "The medical examiner estimates the time of death between midnight and 2 this morning," Inspector Ramirez explained. "She was strangled with her own silk scarf. You can see it there beside the body. But it is this business with the feathers that has us puzzled." I knelt carefully beside my friend as he studied the arrangement of feathers. They were pristine white, perfectly formed, and distributed with what seemed almost ceremonial precision. "The dovecotes," I observed. "They appear undisturbed." "Précisément," murmured Poirot. "And yet we have here perhaps 200 feathers, all apparently from white doves. Most curious, is it not?" Inspector Ramirez nodded grimly. "We believe the feathers were placed there deliberately, perhaps as some form of political symbolism. Senora Petton, as you may know, was quite outspoken in her support of refugees fleeing the fascist movements in Europe. The white dove, it is a symbol of peace, but it can also represent martyrdom." You suspect a political motive? I asked. It seems most likely. We have identified several guests from last evening's gala who possessed questionable political affiliations. There was considerable tension in the expatriate community regarding developments in Europe. Poirot had moved away from the body and was now examining the dovecotes themselves with minute attention. The structures were elaborate affairs of wrought iron and gilt, standing perhaps 8 ft high and housing what appeared to be several dozen birds. "Inspector," he called softly, "you will observe that these coats contain precisely the correct number of doves. None are missing." "Missing?" Ramirez looked confused. If the feathers came from Madame Pettin's own birds, one would expect some evidence of disturbance, would one not? Yet the birds appear calm, well-fed, and completely undisturbed by the events of the night. I followed Poirot's reasoning with growing excitement. "You mean the feathers came from somewhere else?" "Say possible, but more than that. Observe the arrangement." He gestured toward the scattered feathers. "They form an almost perfect circle, each feather placed with care. This was not the random scattering one would expect from disturbed birds or even from feathers thrown hastily about. This was deliberate, artistic even." Inspector Ramirez frowned. "You believe the killer arranged them for symbolic effect?" "The killer arranged them for some purpose," Poirot replied carefully. "Whether symbolic or practical remains to be determined." As we stood contemplating the scene, Dr. Muller appeared at the garden entrance, his face pale with shock. Behind him came Klaus von Habsburg, and I noticed that the handsome Austrian's usually immaculate appearance was somehow disheveled. His collar was askew, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. "Mein Gott," whispered Dr. Muller. "Victoria, how is this possible?" Von Habsburg said nothing, but his eyes fixed on the scattered feathers with an expression I could not interpret. Was it surprise, horror, or something else entirely? "Gentlemen," said Inspector Ramirez formally, "I must ask you all to remain available for questioning. This investigation has only just begun." As the morning wore on, other guests from the previous evening began to arrive, some drawn by curiosity, others apparently summoned by the police. Carmen Delgado appeared shortly after May, dressed in severe black that somehow emphasized rather than diminished her striking beauty. Her composure was perfect, but I noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she crossed herself upon seeing the body. Poirot continued his examination with characteristic thoroughness, photographing the scene in his memory with those remarkable green eyes. I could see him noting details that escaped my observation entirely: the precise angle of Mrs. Pettin's head, the distribution of the feathers, the condition of the surrounding plants and pathways. "Most instructive," he murmured. As we finally prepared to leave the garden, très instructif indeed, the white doves had begun their soft cooing once more, as if the morning's disturbance had never occurred. But I knew that for those of us who had witnessed this scene, the memory of Victoria Pettin lying among the scattered feathers would remain vivid long after the Buenos Airesoon had bleached the flagstones clean. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. By noon, Inspector Ramirez had established a temporary headquarters in one of the smaller salons of the Salon Dorado, and it was there that Poirot and I found ourselves listening to the inspector's preliminary findings. The room, which had doubtless witnessed countless elegant conversations, now bore the stark efficiency of a police inquiry. Chairs arranged in formal rows, a desk covered with official papers, and the unmistakable atmosphere of serious business. The political angle grows more compelling with each interview, Inspector Ramirez explained as he consulted his notes. "We have learned that Senora Pettin was not merely a patron of refugee causes. She was actively involved in facilitating the escape of certain individuals from Nazi-occupied territories." "Ah," murmured Poirot. So she was more than the charitable lady of society she appeared. Indeed, continued the inspector. According to our contacts in the intelligence services, she had been working quietly with British and American networks to establish safe passages for academics, artists, and political dissidents. This work made her a target for those who opposed such activities. I found myself impressed despite the grim circumstances. She was braver than I realized. Courage, yes, agreed the inspector, but also dangerous knowledge. Such work necessarily involves contact with unsavory elements on both sides of the political divide. Money changes hands, false documents are prepared, secrets are traded. It is a world where murder is often the price of betrayal. Poirot had been listening with that peculiar stillness that indicated his complete attention. And among last evening's guests, you have identified potential agents of such hostile interests? Inspector Ramirez nodded gravely. Klaus von Habsburg, for instance. Our records indicate that despite his claims of fleeing Austria for political reasons, he may have maintained connections with certain fascist organizations. His financial circumstances improved dramatically after his arrival in Buenos Aires, yet he has no visible means of support. Interesting, I observed. He certainly seemed to command considerable attention from the ladies last evening. Précisément, said Poirot thoughtfully. And what of the other guests, Dr. Muller, for example? Dr. Muller presents a different sort of puzzle. His credentials as a refugee appear genuine. He lost his position at the University of Vienna when the Nazis dismissed all Jewish faculty. However, he has been observed in the company of individuals known to be involved in revolutionary activities here in Argentina. It is possible he was recruited by communist networks seeking to eliminate what they saw as a bourgeois collaborator. The inspector's theory was logical, yet something about it troubled me. Perhaps it was the memory of the previous evening's social currents, the jealousies and personal tensions that had seemed so much more immediate than political abstractions. You will permit me to examine these political theories more closely? Asked Poirot. Of course. In fact, I hoped you might consent to interview some of the principals yourself. Your methods are unconventional but effective. Our first interview was with Klaus von Habsburg, who had been waiting in an adjacent room under the watchful eye of a police constable. The man who entered Inspector Ramirez's makeshift office was a study in controlled tension. His handsome features were composed, but I noticed a tightness around his eyes that suggested considerable strain. Herr von Habsburg, began Poirot courteously, I trust you'll forgive the necessity of these questions. They are, I assure you, merely routine. I understand completely, Monsieur Poirot. This tragedy has shocked us all. Von Habsburg's English remained perfect, though I detected a slight hoarseness in his voice. You were acquainted with Madame Petain for how long? Nearly 2 years. She was, generous to those of us who arrived here with little more than the clothes on our backs. And the nature of this generosity? A slight hesitation. Financial assistance initially, introductions to Argentine society. She helped many of us establish new lives. Poirot nodded sympathetically. Such assistance must have created a bond of gratitude. Indeed. Von Habsburg's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though Victoria could be demanding in her expectations. Demanding? She took a maternal interest in those she helped. Sometimes her advice regarding personal matters was more extensive than one might prefer. Caught Poirot's eye and saw that he, too, had noted the subtle shift in tone when Von Habsburg spoke of Mrs. Petain's advice. And last evening, after the gala, you remained at the Salon Dorado for some time? I left shortly after the formal entertainment concluded, perhaps 11:30 or midnight. Alone? Another hesitation. Longer this time. Yes, I believe so. You believe so, Herr von Habsburg? The evening was somewhat emotionally charged. I may not recall every detail with perfect clarity. After von Habsburg departed, Inspector Ramirez shared additional intelligence that had arrived from his contacts in the government. It appears that Mrs. Petton had recently received threats, he reported. Anonymous letters warning her to cease her refugee assistance activities. The language suggested either Nazi sympathizers or Argentine nationalists opposed to European interference in local politics. Most convenient, observed Poirot dryly. Anonymous threats create suspicion without providing specific targets for investigation. You doubt their authenticity? I doubt nothing, mon ami, but I observe that anonymous threats are easily fabricated by those who wish to suggest political motives where personal ones might be more accurate. Our next interview was with Carmen Delgado, who arrived wearing the same severe black dress she had worn to the crime scene that morning. Up close, her composure was even more impressive. She answered questions with quiet dignity, her dark eyes never wavering from Poirot's face. "Señorita Delgado?" Poirot began gently. "You knew Madame Petton well." "Victoria was kind to me when I first came to Buenos Aires. She opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and in return I performed at her charitable events. I provided companionship when she was lonely. There was something in the way she said companionship that suggested layers of meaning I could not quite grasp. Relationship was entirely harmonious." Carmen's perfect composure flickered for just a moment. "Victoria could be protective, sometimes overly so." "Protective of you, or protective of others from you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Carmen's eyes flashed, and for an instant I saw beneath her calm exterior to something harder and more dangerous. "Victoria had strong opinions about appropriate behavior," she said finally. "We did not always agree." After Carmen left, Poirot sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. "The political theory? It is seductive," he said at length. "Anonymous threats, fascist agents, revolutionary networks. It provides a framework that explains much while revealing little." "But you're not convinced." "I am convinced, mon ami, that human nature remains constant regardless of political circumstances. Love, jealousy, greed, revenge, these are the motives that drive most murders. Politics may provide the costume, but rarely the true performance." The shadows were lengthening as Inspector Ramirez concluded his briefing for the day. The scattered white feathers in the garden outside seemed to glow in the fading light, still maintaining their mysterious, perfect circle around the spot where Victoria Petton had met her death. Chapter 5. The Tango of Deception. The following morning found Poirot and Meta King breakfast on the terrace of our hotel. The Plaza de Mayo spread out before us in all its colonial grandeur. The events of the previous day had left me somewhat shaken, and I found myself studying the faces of passers-by with newfound suspicion. How easily the veneer of civilization could conceal the most primitive passions. "You are thinking deep thoughts, mon ami," observed Poirot as he carefully arranged his coffee cup and saucer with characteristic precision. "I confess I'm struggling to understand the connections between all these people," I replied. "The political theory seems plausible enough, yet your questions yesterday suggested you suspect something more personal." "Ah, mon ami, the view of the political motive. It is like the tango, is it not? All dramatic gestures and passionate poses designed to capture the attention and distract from the true steps being performed." Before I could respond to this cryptic observation, we were interrupted by the arrival of Miguel Santos, Mrs. Petton's secretary, who approached our table with evident agitation. "Señor Poirot, Señor Hastings," he said breathlessly. "Forgive the intrusion, but I must speak with you. There are things about Señora Petton that the police do not understand, things that may be important to finding her killer." Poirot gestured to an empty chair. Please sit. You will take coffee? Santos shook his head nervously. I have worked for Signora Pettin for 18 months. In that time, I have seen much. Charitable work with the refugees. It was genuine, but it was not her only passion. Continue, prompted Poirot gently. She was a woman of strong emotions, Senor Poirot. Despite her age and position, she felt things very deeply, especially regarding matters of the heart. He leaned forward with interest. You mean she was romantically inclined? Santos nodded reluctantly. There was a gentleman, Signor von Habsburg. At first I thought it was merely the usual kindness she showed to refugees, but as time passed her interest became more personal. And was this interest reciprocated? Asked Poirot. That is the complicated part. Signor von Habsburg was always polite, always grateful, but his attention seemed divided. There were others who claimed his interest. Señorita Delgado, perhaps? Santos's expression darkened. That one is trouble, Signor. She came to Buenos Aires 2 years ago with nothing. No family, no references, just beauty and ambition. Signora Pettin helped her as she helped all of us. But Carmen? She repaid kindness with treachery. The young man's bitterness was evident, and I found myself wondering about his own feelings toward his late employer. In what way? Treachery? Inquired Poirot. She seduced men who were already under Signora Pettin's protection. First there was Dr. Müller, a brief affair that ended badly. Then she set her sights on Signor von Habsburg, and succeeded. You believe so? Yes, but Signora Pettin, she was not a woman to accept defeat easily. In recent weeks, she had been investigating Carmen's background. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Investigating? She hired private investigators in Argentina and Europe. She was convinced that Carmen was not what she seemed, that her real name, her history, her entire identity was fabricated. This was indeed intriguing. And did these investigations bear fruit? Santos glanced around nervously before answering. 3 days ago, Signora Pettin received a telegram from her investigator in Paris. She was very excited, very triumphant. She said she now had the power to expose that little fraud for what she truly is. Did she reveal the contents of this telegram? Not to me. But she did say that Carmen's past would make fascinating reading for Buenos Aires society, and that certain gentlemen would be most interested to learn they had been deceived. After Santos departed, promising to retrieve any relevant correspondence from Mrs. Pettin's private papers, Poirot and I walked slowly through the bustling streets toward the Salon Dorado. The morning air was filled with the sounds of the waking city, horse-drawn carriages, automobile horns, and the musical cadences of Argentine Spanish. The plot thickens considerably, observed Poirot. We now have a triangle of passion complicated by secrets from the past. But surely this supports the political theory, I suggested. If von Habsburg was indeed a fascist agent, and Mrs. Pettin discovered this through her investigations? Possible, mon ami. But consider, why would a political assassin go to such elaborate lengths with the dove feathers? Such staging suggests personal drama rather than professional efficiency. We found Inspector Ramirez at the Salon Dorado interviewing Dr. Müller in the same room where we had questioned the other suspects the previous day. Through the open door, I could hear the doctor's precise German accent responding to questions about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. I retired to my apartment at approximately 11:15, Dr. Müller was saying. My landlady can confirm that he was there by midnight, as she heard me practicing piano, a habit that sometimes disturbs the other tenants. When the interview concluded, Dr. Müller emerged looking haggard and considerably older than his years. Poirot approached him with characteristic courtesy. Herr Doctor, you will forgive my presumption, but you appear distressed beyond what these routine questions might warrant. Dr. Miller's pale eyes fixed on Poirot with something approaching desperation. "Monsieur, you are a man of the world. You understand that the past can cast long shadows into the present?" "Indeed I do." Victoria Petton was a good woman, but she was also, how do you say, unforgiving of what she perceived as betrayal. There are some of us who had reasons to fear her disapproval. Reasons connected to Señorita Delgado, perhaps? Dr. Miller's face flushed. "Carmen is a beautiful woman, and I am a lonely man. I allowed myself to hope for something that was inappropriate to my circumstances." Victoria discovered this and made her displeasure clear. "She threatened you?" "She threatened to withdraw her support for my medical practice in Buenos Aires. Without connections, without the proper introductions, I would have been ruined." "And so you ended the relationship with Señorita Delgado?" "I tried to, but Carmen, she's not easily dismissed. She said she understood my position, but her eyes—" He shuddered. There was something in her eyes that suggested our connection was not as finished as I had hoped. As Dr. Miller departed, I found myself increasingly convinced that the web of relationships surrounding Mrs. Petton was far more complex than any simple political assassination could explain. Yet the scattered white feathers continued to haunt my imagination. Their perfect circular arrangement seemed to mock our efforts to understand their significance. The afternoon brought news from Inspector Ramirez's contacts in the intelligence services. The anonymous threats against Mrs. Petton had been traced to a radical nationalist group known for targeting foreign influence in Argentine politics. Several members had been questioned and released, but their alibis for the night of the murder were suspiciously convenient. Yet, as we stood once again in the patio garden where Victoria Petton had met her death, Poirot seemed less interested in these political developments than in the physical evidence that remained. He spent long minutes studying the dovecotes, the positioning of the fountain, and the precise arrangement of the crime scene. The white feathers gleamed in the late afternoon sun, still maintaining their mysterious perfection, despite 2 days of weather and the passage of investigators. Whatever method had been used to secure them in place, it had been both deliberate and effective, a detail that spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous political violence. Chapter 6, Feathers and Cold Cream, the third day of our investigation dawned gray and overcast, the Buenos Aires sky matching the somber mood that had settled over our inquiry. I found Poirot in our hotel sitting room, surrounded by what appeared to be every newspaper published in the city, their headlines screaming variations of "British Widow Murdered" and "Political Assassination Rocks Buenos Aires Society." "The press. They love a good mystery," he observed, without looking up from a particularly sensational account. "But they see only the surface drama, the exotic setting, the political intrigue, the scattered feathers. They miss the small details that speak the loudest truths." "Such as?" I inquired, settling into the chair opposite him. "Such as this," he replied, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "Yesterday, while Inspector Ramirez pursued his political theories, I conducted my own examination of those mysterious feathers." He reached into an envelope and withdrew a single white dove feather, handling it with the delicacy of a jeweler examining a precious stone. "Observe, mon ami. This particular feather was located at the northeastern edge of the circle, approximately 18 inches from Madame Petton's left shoulder." I peered through the magnifying glass as directed. At first, the feather appeared identical to all the others we had observed, pristine white, perfectly formed, and showing no signs of having been plucked from a living bird. But as Poirot adjusted the angle of the light, I began to discern something unusual. "There appears to be some sort of residue on the shaft," I said slowly. "Précisément, a waxy substance, slightly pink in color, with a distinctive texture and scent. Wax from a candle, perhaps?" "Non, mon ami. This is cold cream, the theatrical variety used by stage performers to prepare their skin for makeup, and to conceal minor imperfections. The significance of this discovery struck me like a physical blow, theatrical cold cream. But it would suggest a connection between our crime scene and someone involved in stage performance. Someone who had handled this feather while wearing such cream on their hands. Poirot carefully returned the feather to its envelope and consulted his pocket. Watch. I have arranged to meet Inspector Ramirez at the Salon Dorado in 1 hour. There are certain experiments I wish to conduct and certain questions I must ask. The journey to the Tango Hall was accomplished in contemplative silence, both of us absorbed in the implications of Poirot's discovery. The overcast sky seemed to press down upon the city like a gray blanket, and I found myself shivering despite the mild temperature. At the Salon Dorado, Inspector Ramirez greeted us with news of his own. We have made progress on the political front, he announced. 3 members of the nationalist group have been taken into custody for questioning. Their leader, a man named Valdez, has a history of violence against European expatriates. Most interesting, replied Poirot politely. And their alibis for the night in question? Conveniently vague. They claim to have been at a political meeting that ended late, but no one can provide specific times or reliable witnesses. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Before we proceed with these political suspects, Inspector, I wonder if you might permit me to conduct one small experiment in the patio garden. Of course. What did you have in mind? I wish to test a theory regarding the placement of those feathers. It will require the assistance of one of your men, and perhaps 30 minutes of undisturbed observation. Inspector Ramirez readily agreed, and we made our way to the scene of the crime. The garden appeared unchanged since our last visit, the dove feathers still maintaining their perfect circular arrangement, the dovecotes standing, serene and undisturbed. Poirot directed the police constable to scatter a handful of ordinary chicken feathers within the existing circle. The contrast was immediately apparent, where Mrs. Petton's mysterious feathers remained precisely in place despite 2 days of weather. The newly scattered ones shifted and moved with every slight breeze. You see? Observed Poirot. The original feathers were not merely scattered. They were secured in position by some adhesive substance. He knelt beside one of the existing feathers and gently probed its base with a small penknife. After a moment of careful work, he looked up with satisfaction. Voila! A small quantity of theatrical wax, the same substance used by stage performers to attach false whiskers and other theatrical elements. I felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift and realign in my mind. Someone with access to theatrical supplies placed these feathers deliberately, someone with both access and experience in their use. Hélas, corrected Poirot. The application is quite professional, invisible unless one knows precisely where to look. At that moment, Carmen Delgado appeared at the garden entrance accompanied by Miguel Santos. She was dressed in a simple black dress that somehow emphasized her natural elegance, and her dark eyes surveyed the crime scene with an expression I could not quite interpret. "Señorita Delgado," called Inspector Ramirez formally, "we have some additional questions if you would be so kind." "Of course," she replied, though I noticed a slight tension in her voice. "I am at your disposal." Poirot approached her with his characteristic courtesy. "Señorita, you are familiar with the use of theatrical cosmetics in your professional work?" "Naturally. Stage lighting requires special preparation. Cold creams, powders, various adhesives, costume elements. And you would have such supplies in your dressing room here at the Salon Dorado?" A pause, almost imperceptible but unmistakably present. "Yes, I maintain a fully equipped dressing room for my performances, including perhaps theatrical wax for securing costume elements." Carmen's composure flickered for just a moment, like a candle flame disturbed by an unexpected breeze. "Yes, such things are standard equipment." Most interesting, murmured Poirot. And in the night of the gala, you mentioned leaving early due to personal distress. Could you be more specific about the nature of this distress? Now the pause was longer, more pronounced. Carmen's dark eyes moved from Poirot to Inspector Ramirez to the scattered feathers at our feet. I had received disturbing news about my family in Europe, she said finally. Personal matters that required privacy to contemplate. I see. And this news came... How? By telegram? Letter? By telephone. A call to the Salon Dorado during the evening. Miguel Santos, who had been listening quietly, suddenly looked confused. But, Señorita Carmen, there were no telephone calls for you that evening. I would have remembered. Carmen's eyes flashed dangerously. You are mistaken, Miguel. The call came during your break, but I did not take a break until after... Gentlemen, interrupted Poirot smoothly. Perhaps we might continue this discussion in more comfortable surroundings. The tension in the garden was now palpable, as if the very air had thickened around us. Carmen's perfect composure had developed hairline cracks, and I could see her struggling to maintain the facade of cooperative innocence. As we prepared to move indoors, Poirot paused beside the dovecotes, his keen eyes studying the birds within. The white doves cooed softly, their gentle sounds a stark contrast to the drama unfolding in their peaceful domain. The overcast sky seemed to press closer, and I had the distinct impression that we were approaching some crucial revelation that would transform our understanding of the entire mystery. Chapter 7. The Truth Behind the Ice. Performance, the confrontation that Inspector Ramirez had been building toward came that very afternoon. Word had spread through the expatriate community that arrests were imminent in the Petten murder case, and by 3 p.m., a small crowd of the curious and concerned had gathered outside the Salon Dorado. The gray sky seemed to mirror the somber mood. As we assembled once again in the elegant salon that had become our makeshift courtroom, Poirot had requested that all the principal figures be present. Klaus von Habsburg, Dr. Miller, Carmen Delgado, and several others who had attended the fatal gala. Inspector Ramirez sat at the head of the room with his files spread before him, while uniformed officers stationed themselves discreetly near the exits. Mes amis, began Poirot, rising to address the gathering, we are here today because a woman has died under circumstances most puzzling. The evidence points in many directions: political conspiracy, revolutionary violence, crimes of passion. But evidence, like the tango itself, can be made to tell different stories depending upon how one chooses to interpret its steps. I noticed Carmen Delgado sitting with remarkable composure in the front row, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Only the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed any inner tension. Inspector Ramirez has built a compelling case for political assassination, Poirot continued. Anonymous threats, fascist agents, revolutionary networks, all very dramatic, all very believable. But I find myself troubled by the staging of this crime. He moved to stand beside a large photograph of the crime scene that had been mounted on an easel. The image showed Mrs. Petten's body, surrounded by the perfect circle of white feathers. These feathers, they tell us much. First, they did not come from the doves housed here at the Salon Dorado. Those birds remain undisturbed and unharmed. Second, they were placed with theatrical precision, each one secured in position with professional-grade adhesive. Third, and most significantly, one of these feathers bears traces of theatrical cold cream. A murmur ran through the assembled group. Klaus von Habsburg leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Poirot with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. The cold cream, it creates a link, Poirot continued. Not to political revolutionaries or fascist agents, but to the world of stage performance. Someone with professional knowledge of theatrical cosmetics handled these feathers while such cream was on their hands. Carmen Delgado's composure cracked almost imperceptibly. I saw her glance quickly toward the exits as if calculating distances and possibilities. "But the cold cream tells us even more than this," said Poirot, his voice taking on that particular tone he adopted when approaching his final revelation. "Such cosmetics are used not merely for stage makeup, but also to conceal imperfections, bruises, for instance. That might tell unwelcome stories?" Dr. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while von Habsburg's handsome features remained a mask of polite attention. "Let us consider the relationships involved," Poirot continued. Madame Petten, a woman of mature years but passionate temperament, devoted to Herr von Habsburg but Señorita Delgado, young, beautiful, and equally attracted to the same gentleman. Both women vying for his attention, both possessing information that could damage the other. Inspector Ramirez nodded approvingly. "The classic triangle of passion, but with complications." Madame Petten had discovered disturbing facts about Señorita Delgado's past, information that would have destroyed her position in Buenos Aires society. Meanwhile, Señorita Delgado possessed knowledge of another sort. Carmen's dark eyes flashed dangerously. "I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot." "I am implying nothing, mademoiselle. I am stating facts. You knew that Herr von Habsburg's attentions came at a price, that his charm masked a violent temperament. The bruises on your wrists, which you concealed with theatrical makeup, told that story clearly enough." Von Habsburg half rose from his chair. "Now see here, Poirot." "Please, monsieur, remain seated," said Inspector Ramirez firmly. "Continue, Monsieur Poirot." Madame Petten had noticed these signs of abuse. She had, in fact, planned to use this knowledge not to protect Señorita Delgado, but to drive her away from von Habsburg permanently. She arranged to meet Carmen in the garden after the gala to deliver her ultimatum. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the sounds from the street seemed muted, as if the entire world was holding its breath. But Carmen arrived at that meeting with her own plans. Poirot continued relentlessly. She had endured enough violence, enough threats, enough competition from an older woman who used wealth and social position as weapons. When Madame Petten threatened to expose her past and steal Klaus away with promises of marriage and security, Carmen's control finally snapped. "This is ridiculous," Carmen said. But her voice lacked conviction. "You have no proof." "Ah, but I do," replied Poirot quietly. "The feathers were your mistake, mademoiselle. You scattered them to suggest political symbolism, to create the impression of revolutionary assassination. But you used your professional supplies to secure them in place. The same theatrical wax and cold cream that used to conceal the evidence of von Habsburg's brutality." Carmen's facade crumbled like a house of cards in a sudden wind. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked not like a glamorous performer, but like a frightened woman backed into a corner. She was going to destroy everything, Carmen whispered so quietly that we had to strain to hear. "My career, my reputation, my chance for happiness. She said Klaus would marry her, that I was nothing but a common little chorus girl who deserved whatever treatment I received. So you killed her," stated Inspector Ramirez. Carmen's laugh was bitter as winter rain. "I defended myself when she began to scream at me, to threaten me with public humiliation. Something inside me broke. I never meant for it to happen. My hands were around her throat before I realized what I was doing." The confession hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Several people in the room seemed to exhale simultaneously, as if they had been holding their breath without realizing it. "And the feathers?" prompted Poirot gently. I remembered reading about political assassinations in Europe, bodies found with symbolic messages. I thought if I could make it appear political, no one would look too closely at personal motives. I had the supplies in my dressing room. Her voice trailed off as the full weight of her situation became apparent. Inspector Ramirez nodded to his officers, who moved quietly to flank Carmen's chair. The gray afternoon light seemed to dim further as the tragic drama reached its conclusion. Outside, the white doves in their ornate coats resumed their gentle cooing, oblivious to the human tragedy that had unfolded in their peaceful domain. Chapter 8. The Final Curtain. The Arrest of Carmen. Delgado created a sensation throughout Buenos Aires that lasted well into the evening hours. As Poirot and I made our way back to our hotel through streets buzzing with excited conversation, I found myself reflecting on the tragic sequence of events that had led to this conclusion. "It seems almost incredible," I said as we settled into the quiet sanctuary of our sitting room, "that such passion could drive someone to murder." "Oh, no," replied Poirot, carefully adjusting the armrests on his chair before sitting down. "What is incredible is not the passion itself, but the elaborate deception that followed. Carmen Delgado was not merely a woman driven to violence. She was an artist who created a masterpiece of misdirection. The evening newspapers had already begun printing special editions with headlines proclaiming the solution to the Tango Hall murder. From our window, I could see vendors on the street corners waving the papers enthusiastically, their voices carrying fragments of the story up to our rooms. Inspector Ramirez joined us shortly after 9 looking simultaneously satisfied and troubled. He had spent the afternoon processing Carmen's formal confession and coordinating with various government departments to close the political aspects of the investigation. "She has admitted everything," he reported, settling wearily into the remaining chair. "The murder, the staging with the feathers, even her real identity. Her name is not Carmen Delgado. It is Maria Santos. And she was indeed a chorus girl from a third-rate theater in Rosario before she reinvented herself for Buenos Aires society." "And the threats against Mrs. Petton?" I asked. "Fabricated entirely. Carmen wrote them herself to support the political theory. She is quite intelligent. She understood that the more complex and mysterious the crime appeared, the less likely anyone would be to examine the simple personal motives." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "The human mind, it prefers the elaborate conspiracy to the simple truth. She counted upon this weakness in our reasoning. What I find most disturbing," continued Inspector Ramirez, "is the cold calculation behind her actions. After strangling Mrs. Petton in what she claims was a moment of passion, she had sufficient presence of mind to return to her dressing room, gather the necessary supplies, and create that elaborate tableau with the feathers. That suggests remarkable self-control for someone supposedly acting in the heat of emotion." "Précisément," agreed Poirot. "Which brings us to the most troubling aspect of this entire affair, the role of Klaus von Habsburg." I looked up sharply. Surely he wasn't involved in the actual murder. "No, but his treatment of both women created the conditions that made murder almost inevitable. A man who uses his charm to manipulate vulnerable women, who employs violence to maintain control, bears responsibility for the consequences of his actions." Inspector Ramirez consulted his notes. "Von Habsburg has admitted to the relationship with Carmen and to what he terms occasional physical correction, hecklings. Mrs. Petton knew nothing of this, but Carmen's confession tells a different story. Apparently, Mrs. Petton had witnessed one of these corrections and planned to use the knowledge against Carmen. The implications were deeply unsettling. Victoria Petton, whom I had admired as a charitable woman devoted to helping refugees, had been prepared to use another woman's victimization as a weapon in their romantic rivalry. So she was not the innocent victim we initially supposed," I observed. "In murder, mon ami, there are rarely any truly innocent parties," replied Poirot sadly. "Each person brings their own guilt, their own secrets, their own capacity for both good and evil." As the evening progressed, Inspector Ramirez shared additional details from Carmen's confession. The confrontation in the garden had begun, as Mrs. Petton expected, with threats to expose Carmen's true identity and her history as Klaus von Habsburg's victim. But when Mrs. Petton suggested that Carmen deserved whatever treatment she received, and that she would ensure Klaus married her instead, Carmen's carefully maintained self-control had finally shattered. She strangled her with the silk scarf during what appears to have been a brief but violent struggle, Inspector Ramirez explained. Then, realizing what she had done, she spent nearly an hour creating the false crime scene. She returned to her dressing room, gathered the dove feathers she had been saving for a special performance, and used her theatrical supplies to arrange them around the body. "The performance of her life," I murmured. "Indeed. And it might have succeeded if not for that single feather contaminated with cold cream. Such a small detail, to bring down such an elaborate deception." The next morning brought news that Klaus von Habsburg had departed Buenos Aires on the first available ship bound for Europe. Inspector Ramirez had questioned him extensively, but found no evidence of direct involvement in the murder itself. His crime was of a different nature: the systematic abuse of women who depended upon his protection. "He will surface again somewhere else," Poirot observed as we read the shipping reports in the morning paper. "Such men always do. They find new victims, create new webs of deceit and control." Dr. Muller, by contrast, had remained in the city and resumed his medical practice. Miguel Santos had found new employment with another wealthy expatriate family. The other guests from that fatal gala had gradually returned to their normal routines, though the shadow of the events would undoubtedly linger in their memories. Carmen Delgado, or Maria Santos as she was now known, awaited trial in the women's prison, where she had reportedly returned to her real name and abandoned the theatrical persona that had served her so well. Inspector Ramirez mentioned that she seemed almost relieved to have the elaborate fiction of her Buenos Aires identity. As Poirot and I prepared for our own departure from Buenos Aires, I found myself drawn once more to the Salon Dorado. The patio garden had been restored to its original beauty, the flagstones cleaned, the dove feathers removed, and the fountain flowing peacefully once again. The white doves cooed softly in their ornate coats, their gentle sounds a reminder that life continued despite the human tragedies played out beneath their roost. It was a performance worthy of the stage, Poirot reflected, as we stood where Victoria Petton had met her death. Carmen understood that the most effective lies are those that contain elements of truth. Political tensions were real, personal rivalries existed, and human passions ran high. She simply choreographed these elements into a dance that led away from her own guilt. The late afternoon sun slanted through the jacaranda trees, casting the same dappled shadows I remembered from that first evening, when the garden had seemed a place of romance and possibility. Now I understood how easily beauty could conceal danger, how passion could masquerade as politics, and how the most deadly performances were often those played out in real life rather than upon the stage. The Buenos Aires adventure had ended, but its lessons about the complexity of human nature would remain with us long after we returned to the familiar streets of London, where even the most ordinary mysteries seemed simple by comparison to the elaborate tango of deception we had witnessed among the scattered white feathers of the Salon Dorado. Thank you so much for joining us for today's mystery. If you enjoyed this mystery, please subscribe for more detective tales and share it with fellow lovers of intrigue. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Ailey signing off from Cafe Tales.